Narrator, tone, cheerful. I was having a joyful dinner with my adoptive parents when my biological parents found me. The police burst through the door.
What are you doing?
Narrator, tone, terrified. John immediately shielded Sarah and me behind him. I trembled with fear. They had found me after all.
Emily, we finally found you. Do you know how worried your mom and dad have been?
Narrator, tone, serious. The woman in front of me, tears and snot streaming down her face, was my biological mother, but I felt she never treated me as her real daughter. Everything I saw now was just her acting. I clung tightly to Sarah.
Officer, what's going on here?
Narrator, tone, hopeful. John doted on me. He and Sarah had no children. When I escaped from the couple who had trafficked me, they took me in.
Sweetheart, why are you wandering here alone? Where are your mom and dad?
Narrator, tone, sad. That was the first thing John said to me. At that time, I had been through so much abuse from the traffickers that I was very wary of people. But he didn't mind. He bought me jelly and candy. I hadn't eaten in a long time, and I devoured the snacks he bought me. But it wasn't enough. I was still very hungry. My face was dirty, and I looked at him with round eyes.
Little girl, you must be starving. How about Auntie takes you to eat?
Narrator, tone, cheerful. Sarah pointed to a restaurant not far away. I thought for a while and then nodded. After eating, I timidly said, "Thank you." They were very happy to hear me speak. Then they asked if I knew where my home was, and I shook my head. Actually, I knew. I was kidnapped at 5 and escaped at 8. But the memories before I was 5 were too deep to forget. Then John and Sarah took me to their home. These 3 months were probably the happiest I had ever been since I was born. But happiness was so short-lived. Narrator, tone, terrified. Seeing the police break in and the fake kind faces of my biological parents, I knew something was wrong.
You are suspected of illegal child trafficking. We need to take you in for questioning.
You traffickers. You can't have children of your own, so you harm mine. Shameless. Go away. Officer, sentence them to the harshest penalty.
Narrator, tone, terrified. My mother's sharp voice was harsh and venomous.
No, officer, John and Sarah saved me. They are not bad people.
Narrator, tone, excited. I ran to the police officer. Today, John had bought me an Elsa princess dress, and I wore a crown. For a moment, I almost believed I was a princess.
Little one, the officers will talk to you later. For now, go home with your mom and dad and get some rest. Okay.
Narrator, tone, sad. The officer was gentle, a knight in shining armor unknowingly pushing me into a dark abyss.
I don't want to go back. I want to stay with John and Sarah. They are my parents.
Narrator, tone, terrified. I cried and clung to my adoptive parents, refusing to let go no matter who tried to pull me away. Narrator, tone, serious. Slap. A slap, and the air instantly froze. My biological father had slapped me. Even the officer didn't expect it.
They are your parents? What about your mom and me? Do you know how your mom hasn't been able to eat or sleep for the past 3 months because of you? You ungrateful little brat.
Narrator, tone, terrified. My father reached out to grab me, and I bit his hand hard. He pushed me away, leaving 2 rows of teeth marks on his hand.
I can't go on! My daughter doesn't recognize me! What's the point of living?
Narrator, tone, serious. My mother sat on the ground, slapping her thighs. Anyone who saw this would say this mother was pitiful. Only I knew how good her acting was. She was the one who sold me. My biological father had slapped me. Even the officer didn't expect it.
They are your parents?
What about your mom and me? Do you know how your mom hasn't been able to eat or sleep for the past 3 months because of you?
You ungrateful little brat.
My father reached out to grab me, and I bit his hand hard. He pushed me away, leaving 2 rows of teeth marks on his hand.
I can't go on. My daughter doesn't recognize me. What's the point of living?
My mother sat on the ground, slapping her thighs. Anyone who saw this would say this mother was pitiful. Only I knew how good her acting was. She was the one who sold me. After saying those cruel words, my mother slammed the basement door shut, leaving me to cry alone in the dark. Perhaps the soundproofing was too good, as I didn't wake anyone. After that day, I developed a high fever, and at one point, I thought I might die. When I woke up again, I was in the hospital. There was no one by my side. I watched as the other children in the ward had their parents with them. I felt both envious and inferior.
Doctor, will my daughter have any lasting effects?
It's hard to say. She had a fever of 42 degrees. You might have thought it was just a minor cold, but such a high fever is dangerous. Some people suffer brain damage, and there are cases where complications lead to serious consequences due to delayed treatment.
My mother played the role of a good mom, holding my hand as we left. As soon as we stepped out of the hospital, she let go of my hand.
Did it fry your brain? It would be better if it did.
When we got home, my father showed no concern for me.
Is she cured? If you ask me, it would have been better if she didn't make it. Why spend money to save her?
My grandmother's cruelty towards me only increased. I didn't understand what I had done wrong. If they didn't like me, why did they bring me into this world? I asked Nanny Alice, and she gave me a good idea. She told me to be sweeter and more affectionate.
After all, no one hits a smiling face.
Okay, thank you, Nanny Alice.
Nanny Alice patted my head.
You're welcome.
In the evening, I asked Nanny Alice to teach me how to make soup. I prepared the ingredients myself and made winter melon, pork rib, and corn soup for my mother. Following the plan Nanny Alice and I rehearsed, I brought the soup to my mother.
What is it?
She was holding my brother and looked at me with indifference, but today she didn't scold me. She even let me hold my brother so she could drink the soup. It was the first time I held my brother. He was so cute, with his chubby cheeks. It seemed Nanny Alice's method worked. If I treated them like this, they would surely come to like me eventually. When my father was about to come home from work, I stood at the gate, waiting to greet him from afar. He got out of the car, saw me, and smiled happily, picking me up in his arms.
Did you upset your mother today?
No, Daddy.
My father kissed me on the cheek. I cried. It had been so long since he had been so gentle with me. He wiped away my tears.
What's wrong, Emily? Why are you crying?
Daddy, will you hold me like this again tomorrow?
Of course, as long as you're good, Daddy will always like Emily. Don't cry.
By the time we entered the house, I had stopped crying. Today, the kindergarten gatekeeper let out a huge fart that blew off our teacher's hat. My friends and I found it hilarious. I wanted to tell my father about it, but I was interrupted halfway.
Emily, where have you been? Have you been lying to your father again?
I didn't understand why my mother, who had been kind to me earlier, suddenly accused me again.
Honey, why is our life so hard? Emily must be a bad seed. What should we do? Recently, those super male gene babies have been popular. Do you think Emily might be one of those kids?
I didn't know how to react and stood there blankly.
What are you thinking? Super male jeans are for boys. Emily is a girl. How could she be one?
I didn't understand what they were talking about, but I knew my father was defending me. Nanny Alice looked shocked at my mother's words, but what came next was even more shocking.
Emily pinched her brother today.
I hadn't. I didn't know what I had done wrong. My mother had been kind to me in the afternoon. Why was she falsely accusing me now?
Emily, is what your mother said true?
I bit my lip and shook my head, afraid he would hurt me. But he didn't believe me and hit me anyway. It hurt so much.
What a wicked girl.
Then he threw me into the basement and turned off the heating. He said I should reflect on my actions and only let me out when I admitted to pinching my brother. Until I was taken away, he never let me out. I stayed in that dark, cold basement for half a month, wearing only thin clothes. It was so cold, so dark, and so scary. One afternoon, half a month later, my mother came. Emily's mother took her upstairs, gave her a bath, and applied body lotion, making her smell nice. She then handed her over to a man. The man wanted to change her pants, even though she had just put them on. Emily looked at her mother for help.
Now you're as dirty as I am. Let's see if you dare to speak out.
Her eyes were terrifying, like a demon's. She raised her eyebrows at the man, and his eyes turned equally frightening. Emily was so scared that she wet her pants. In a panic, she bit the man who lunged at her and ran out of the house. She hid in a trash can, smeared shoe polish all over her face to avoid being recognized.
I was afraid of my mother. I feared she would tell my father that I had been disobedient, and he would hit me again.
Emily was found that same afternoon. Trembling, she didn't dare to get close. Her mother cried sorrowfully.
I was wrong. I shouldn't have taken out my frustrations from Margaret on you. I will clear your name in front of your father. I promise to love you, your father, and Michael, and we will be a happy family.
Hearing this, Emily finally burst into tears, and her mother hugged her tightly. It was the first time she had felt her mother's embrace, so warm, and she greedily soaked it in. She looked forward to the beautiful future her mother painted for her and believed her once again.
Let's buy a beautiful princess dress, Emily. Do you want any other gifts?
No, I don't want anything else.
Emily is such a good girl.
Even though Emily said she didn't want anything, her mother still bought her a hamburger. Emily got into her mother's car, happily heading home. She must have been exhausted because she fell asleep shortly after getting in the car. When Emily woke up, she was in the arms of a stranger. He seemed startled to see her awake. He looked fierce and scary.
Mom, Mom, Mom.
The man turned to look behind him, and Emily followed his gaze to see her mother.
Mom!
Why aren't you leaving yet?
The man hurriedly carried Emily to the passenger seat of a truck. She was even more terrified, crying and screaming for her mother. But her mother covered her ears and got into her car without looking back, then sped away.
My mother sold me to traffickers.
It turned out Emily's mother never loved her. Everything she said and did was just an act to sell her. The next 3 years were a living nightmare. The couple who bought Emily didn't have children, but they didn't like her either. They bought her just to serve them.
I had to call the man Your Majesty and the woman Your Highness and refer to myself as a servant. Every morning at 5 a.m., I had to get up to cook for them. If I was even a second late, I would be met with endless verbal abuse and countless beatings. Most of the time, they didn't hit or scold me because I did something wrong, but because of their whims.
The man was on top of the woman, not bullying her. He told me they were making a little brother for me and made me watch them. The first time I saw them doing this, I was so scared that I threw up and had nightmares at night. I suddenly remembered the time my mother was bullied by that man. After that day, my mother disliked me even more. She had an affair and betrayed my father. She was afraid I would tell my father, so she wanted to make sure I could never speak up. But even a tiger doesn't eat its cubs. She couldn't bring herself to harm me, so she could only slander me in front of my father. Even if my father found out, he would think I was lying and that I was a bad child. But I was only 3 years old then. How could I understand any of this? I stayed with that twisted couple for 3 years. In the first year, I tried to escape many times, but each time I was caught and beaten badly. I became afraid of being beaten, so I behaved. One day, I watched a TV show where a police officer went undercover to catch thieves. The officer pretended to be obedient to gather information and then successfully escaped. So, I learned to pretend to be obedient and stopped trying to escape. In the first year, they watched me closely. In the second year, they allowed me to go out, but they always followed me. Until one day in the third year, a guest came to the house, and they needed soy sauce for cooking. They sent me to get it, and I seized the opportunity. Following the plot of the TV show, I disguised my excitement because it was the first time I went out alone. I calmly walked out of the building, knowing the man was watching me through the window. When I reached a corner where they couldn't see me, I ran like crazy, not looking back, running from dusk till dawn. I actually ran back to my home because the bad couple lived not far from my house. When I was about to knock on the door, I hesitated. I was afraid my mother would open the door and send me back to those bad people. So, I ran again. I went to the park where my father used to take me. I sat there for a long time, remembering how my father used to play horsey with me, carrying me on his shoulders. I didn't ask for much, just not to be scolded or beaten all the time, and to be loved occasionally. It was in that park, after being hungry for several days, that I met my adoptive parents. At first, when I went home with them, I was very cautious and didn't speak. Whenever they approached me, I would curl up in a corner. I was afraid they would torture me like that couple. But they didn't. Even though I didn't speak for several days, they treated me with care. They even gave me a name, Emily. They told me stories every day, held me, and comforted me to sleep. I received a love I never dared to dream of before. The day before the police came, Sarah took me to the mall to buy clothes. When I saw the Elsa princess dress, I couldn't move my feet, staring at it. Sarah noticed my interest.
Emily likes Elsa, huh? Mommy will buy it for you.
Thank you, Mommy. At first, my adoptive parents wanted to take me to the police station, but I refused. I told them about my experiences and my parents, including my mother's affair. Emily, it's okay. From now on, we are your parents. They didn't have children, so they adored me and treated me like a princess. It was the first time I realized how simple it could be to receive parental love. But this wonderful life lasted only 3 months.
I want my mom and dad. You are not my parents.
When I got home, Linda pretended to be kind to me.
Emily, you made it so hard for me to find you. She might have thought I was too young to remember, but I remembered every word she said to me clearly, and now I had grown up.
You are a bad mom. I don't want you. I want my mom and dad.
Emily! We are your parents.
I was so scared that I didn't dare to speak again. I could only sob silently. A few days later, Officer Smith came to understand the situation.
Little one, did that couple ever hit or scold you?
No. They treated me very well. They are my parents. Officer, please don't put my parents in jail.
John and Sarah were the only people in the world who treated me well and loved me sincerely. I didn't want them to go to jail because of me. Only bad people should go to jail. I glanced at my mother, who was staring at me intently. She was warning me not to say anything wrong.
So, little one, do you remember what the bad people who took you looked like?
I nodded, then shook my head. Officer Smith didn't get much information from me. It wasn't that I didn't remember, I was afraid my mother would send me back. I could only pretend not to remember. Before Officer Smith left, he told my father that if I remembered anything about the bad people, I should tell them immediately. My younger brother, Michael, was already 5 years old. But when my father asked him to call me sister, he hid behind Margaret and made faces at me.
I don't have a sister. Grandma said that even if she comes back, she's just another nanny. She still has to listen to me.
No one in the family objected to Michael's words. He was truly a spoiled child. I envied him. I no longer lived in the basement, they gave me the nanny's room. My father's company hadn't been doing well for the past 2 years, and they had let the nanny go. Naturally, I became the nanny of the house. Not long after, my father told me that my adoptive parents had returned home and hadn't gone to jail. He also asked me how much I remembered about being taken. I just lowered my head and didn't speak. I was thinking, if I told my father the truth, would he believe me?
Dad, if I said, just if, that mom sold me on purpose, would you believe me?
I didn't wait for my father's answer before I heard my mother's scream.
You wicked child! Even a tiger doesn't eat its cubs! How can you tell your father that I, your mother, sold you on purpose? Honey, Emily is really a habitual liar.
Slap. I realized I didn't need to know the answer. My father's slap was clearer than any answer.
Apologize to your mother. Do you know how your mother got through these years when you were missing? She would wake up crying every night, dreaming of you, blaming herself, and having nightmares. Is this how you repay her?
I looked at them coldly. I often asked myself, why am I their daughter? I didn't even realize that my nose was bleeding uncontrollably.
Did I hit you that hard?
He and my mother took me to the bathroom, splashing cold water on the back of my neck and making me tilt my head back. It took a long time for the bleeding to stop. I saw the guilt in my father's eyes. He was my father, but he didn't love me. My mother took me back to my small room and shut the door tightly.
You little brat! I don't know how much you remember about the past, but if you dare to say anything in front of your father, I'll tear your mouth apart.
It's hard to imagine how a mother could be so cruel to her own daughter. I had long since gotten used to it and held no hope for her.
Mom, did you ever love me?
This was the first time I had ever asked this question. I saw a strange light flicker in my mother's eyes, as if she was moved for a moment. But in an instant, it was replaced by malice.
If I could, I would rather never have given birth to you. Because of you, I was humiliated by your grandmother, and because of you, I live cautiously every day. If you hadn't seen what you did back then, maybe I would still have some feelings for you. But now, I wish you were gone.
Her words didn't stir much emotion in me. It was indeed because of that incident that she treated me this way. But she was the one who did it, why blame me? Grandma favored boys over girls, that was her problem, why take it out on me? What did I do wrong? I couldn't understand it at 3 years old, and I still couldn't at 8.
Emily, go watch your brother and make sure he doesn't run around.
My father said, looking at my brother playing soccer in the yard.
Okay.
I sat on the steps of the courtyard.
Hey, Brett, come play with me.
He called me the same name Grandma did, mimicking her. He didn't remember that the first word he ever said was sister. Thinking of this made my nose tingle. I loved my brother, but he would never love me. As he was playing, he kicked the ball into a rock and fell towards the steps. If he hit them, he would be seriously hurt. So I ran over and used myself as a cushion. My head hit the steps. It hurt. I didn't cry, but my brother did. His cries brought the family running.
Don't cry, sweetheart. Grandma will make it better.
Then she turned and glared at me.
You worthless girl. You can't even watch your brother properly. Did you do it on purpose?
Her words caught my father's attention.
Emily, did you try to hurt your brother on purpose?
No.
You little brat, what have you learned out there these past few years? He's your own brother, and you still want to harm him.
My mother added fuel to the fire. My father got even angrier and broke a branch from a tree in the yard. He hit me with it. After years of mistreatment, I'd endured worse beatings than this. This pain was nothing. But my brother, who had been comforted by Grandma, suddenly started crying even harder.
It's not sister. Boo-hoo, Dad, don't hit sister. She's protecting me.
I hadn't been crying, but when I heard my brother call me sister, I couldn't hold back any longer. I started crying too. When my father heard my brother's words, he stood there in a daze. Realizing he had wronged me, he immediately threw away the stick in his hand and hugged me with deep remorse.
Emily, I'm sorry. I wronged you.
A belated apology didn't matter anymore. Margaret took my brother inside. My mother, perhaps afraid I would say something to my father, stood there motionless. I couldn't feel any pain in my body. Maybe the beatings had increased my tolerance for pain. Before I passed out, I felt nothing. When I woke up again, my head was wrapped in thick bandages. It turned out I had hit my head while saving my brother, and it required 5 stitches.
Sister, have some candy.
My brother's soft little hand offered me his favorite white rabbit candy. It was also my favorite candy when I was little. I smiled and thanked him. We ate the sweet candy together. While eating, we even compared whose teeth had more candy stuck to them. Then we smiled at each other. It was the sweetest candy I had ever tasted. It was also the first genuine affection I received in this family. He was my brother. The first word he ever spoke was sister. I couldn't help but feel a lump in my throat. Brother, can I hug you? I asked him cautiously. I was afraid of being rejected because when I was little, Margaret said my hands were dirty, and I feared my brother would think the same.
Sister, hug me if you want.
He opened his arms and hugged me tightly. He was small, soft, and sweet.
Let go of him!
My mother saw us hugging and immediately came over to pull us apart.
Stay away from my son,
she said and took my brother out of the room. As he left, my brother smiled sweetly at me and said,
Sister, I'll bring you more white rabbit candy later.
Okay. But I never got that candy. I fell ill. That night, I had a high fever that wouldn't go down. When my father came to see me, he touched my forehead. Then he angrily scolded my mother. It was the first time I saw my father so worried about me. But I didn't have the energy to pay attention to him. I felt suffocated, like I couldn't breathe. My nose started bleeding uncontrollably again.
Emily, hold on. Dad will take you to the hospital right away.
Dad, it hurts.
Emily, be good. It won't hurt soon.
I ended up in the emergency room again. But this time, it wasn't as easy as the last. The doctor looked at me with a worried expression, even though he tried to hide it. I knew I was in grave condition. I saw them shake their heads at my father. I knew my own body. I looked at my swollen, pale body. And the repeated nosebleeds and fevers over the past few days. I knew I didn't have long to live. But I wasn't afraid because living was really painful.
Emily, what do you want to eat? Dad will buy it for you.
I don't want to eat anything.
Do you want to watch a cartoon? How about Frozen? Dad will play it for you.
His words made me feel a bit better. He still remembered I loved watching Frozen.
Dad, am I going to pass away?
My father choked up at my words.
No, our Emily will live a long life.
Dad, I remember the bad people they live at.
Bad people shouldn't go unpunished, so I told my father their address. I knew he would seek justice for me. That night, I told him how the bad people had bullied and mistreated me. My father cried uncontrollably. He kept apologizing, saying he was sorry. But what good was an apology? I didn't tell him about my mother.
Dad, I want to see my parents.
In the hospital, my condition worsened day by day.
Okay, Dad will call them right away.
My father knew I meant my adoptive parents, so he took the phone I had dialed and left the room. Watching his departing figure, I slowly closed my eyes. The monitor showed a flat line. The alarm sounded. All the medical staff rushed to save me. After my father finished his call, he saw the scene in the hospital room and collapsed to the ground. Despite half an hour of resuscitation efforts, I showed no signs of life. The doctor pronounced my time of death.
Time of death, 1445.
When my adoptive parents arrived at the hospital, the doctor was covering me with a white sheet.
No. My dear Emily.
Sarah collapsed onto my body, crying in anguish. John punched my father, his eyes red with rage.
How long have you had her back? Is this how you take care of your daughter?
My father stood there, allowing John to hit and scold him, saying nothing. I knew my father felt deeply guilty, but what good did that do? I was already gone. Watching my adoptive parents in pain, I wanted to hug them, but no matter how close I got, I couldn't touch them.
Thank you, Mom and Dad. Without you, I might never have known what parental love is.
My adoptive parents told my father about what my mother had done. At first, he didn't believe it and cursed at them.
Lies. All lies.
When my father returned home, my mother was the first to greet him.
Is Emily still not better? Why is she so delicate? It's just a fever. You should bring her back soon. It's exhausting for you to keep running back and forth.
You're Emily's mother. Why don't you go see her?
My father's words left my mother speechless.
Oh, it's just a child being sick. It's no big deal. Besides, she's so bad, you can't spoil her, or who knows what trouble she'll cause when she grows up.
My mother continued to speak ill of me.
Smack.
My father slapped her hard across the face. My mother looked shocked.
You hit me?
Yes, I hit you. You wretched woman.
My father's fists landed on my mother repeatedly.
Aw! What did that girl tell you? Why are you hitting me?
How cruel can you be? Just because Emily saw you cheating, you tried to frame her. You didn't dare to do it yourself, so you sold her to someone else. She's your own daughter.
My father cried uncontrollably.
That girl told you? How dare she? I'll tear her mouth apart.
My mother ran towards the door like a madwoman, but my father grabbed her hair and threw her to the ground.
The girl you called dead is already gone. Are you satisfied now?
My father's words silenced the entire room. My mother sat on the ground, dumbfounded, muttering.
Dead, dead.
I didn't know what she was thinking at that moment, but it certainly wasn't regret. After my funeral, my parents divorced, and my father got custody of my brother, Michael. My father didn't bother with a paternity test. I knew that whether Michael was his biological son or not, he would always be his son. After the divorce, my mother lost her sanity. If she hadn't, she would have faced legal consequences for her cruelty. Whether she was truly insane or not, she would live the rest of her life as if she were. When my father saw her again, she was rummaging through a trash can for food.
Emily, Grandma didn't really hate you. Grandma is sorry.
It was just the old-fashioned preference for boys over girls. But I didn't need her apology. All apologies were so light, but the harm I suffered was real. My brother cried the hardest, but he was young and quickly moved on from the sadness. He would soon forget he ever had a sister. My adoptive parents visited me every year, sharing their lives with me. Later, they had a daughter named Sienna.
We will love Sienna as much as we loved you, Emily.
I wanted to kiss Sienna and hoped she could pass on my love to my adoptive parents. My father came to my grave every year to repent, apologize, and cry.
I'm so sorry, Emily.
But what good are apologies? Not all hurts can be erased with a simple "I'm sorry." He might have loved me, but not enough. I couldn't forgive those who hurt me. I couldn't forgive them, nor could I bring myself to. Living in guilt for the rest of his life was my punishment for him. Finally, some good news. The people who trafficked me were caught by the police. Over 10 years, they had trafficked and mistreated 20 to 30 children. Due to the severity of their crimes, they were sentenced to death. The sun rose, and I moved towards the light, embracing my own brightness. Perhaps no one in this world would remember I was here, but I remembered that I had tried to love this world.
The end.